Welcome to the show Goldsquadrongays. It's the podcast where Charles goes rogue and takes over the podcast because Bradley was busy doing something else. So Charles is going to take over and talk about Legends books he likes a lot. I'm your host, Charles Rogers, and with me is a guest. Guest, would you like to introduce yourself?
Gold leader reporting in. It's Andy, aka a one-hat town. Glad to be back on my favorite Star Wars podcast.
Aww. Yep, Andy is joining us from Force Friends Rewatch and also Good Neighbors. Is that one's still going on? I think you guys went on a new season.
Yep, Good Neighbors is about 30 episodes into our second campaign. We're an actual Play Monster of the Week podcast. It's really good. You should listen to it. And Ending Pending is my third podcast.
Yes, as part of the Where They May Radio Network, if I'm recalling correctly.
Hell yeah, you got your plugs down.
I remember things. I remember other people's plugs really well. That's the thing I've discovered about myself, is I listen to so many podcast episodes of other people, I can do other people's plugs from memory. Bradley hates it. He absolutely despises it. Speaking of Bradley, he's not here for a couple of weeks. He will be back when he finishes Brotherhood, but for a couple of weeks, Bradley is taking a step back. So I'm going to be asking some people to join me, and we're going to talk about some Legends books. And I could think of no better book to start with than the 2005 novel, Star Wars Revenge of the Sith.
I mean, the best Star Wars book
The best Star
written.
Wars book. The book that changed my life, yes. Andy, before we get started, would you like some additional information on Star Wars Revenge of the Sith?
I sure would. Hell yeah.
Star Wars Revenge of the Sith was written by Matthew Stover based on a story in quotation marks and screenplay also in quotation marks by George Lucas. It was published on April 2nd, 2005, which I think was prior to the movie coming out.
Oh yeah, it came out first.
Yeah, it came out first, and I remember actually reading the comic first.
I read the comic before I saw the movie.
Yeah, I didn't realize that I was reading the comic adaptation of Revenge of the Sith. I thought
Neither did I.
Reading another comic. Did you and I have the same moments when they kill Count Dooku?
Yeah, I was just like, wait, is this the movie? Like, I was so confused. Yep. I was like, did I just ruin the movie?
Yep. I was reading it like in my friend's basement, and I was like, oh, this is a new comic. I'm sure it ties into the movie, yada, yada, yada. Did Count Dooku just fucking die?
Qui-Gon's noble end on the Phantom Menace soundtrack and the novelization and comic for Revenge of the Sith coming out a week before the movie is like crazy. That shit would never happen today.
No, it fucking would not. They would never do that shit now.
Whenever I see people get super mad about spoilers on Twitter concerning Star Wars, I'm just like, guys, like, where were you 20 years ago? Like, Star Wars has been like, come on.
I'm just glad Twitter didn't exist 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Good Lord. The discourse around the prequels was bad enough. Like,
oh, it was brutal. We
didn't need like Twitter, because the forums were already bad. Like, you can still go back and read some of the old forums and stuff. It was nasty. And the fact we didn't have Twitter was probably a good thing in hindsight.
I got us off topic. Matthew Stover, 2005.
Matthew Stover, 2005, wrote this book. The unabridged audiobook, which is the one I care about, was released on September 13th, 2005. It is narrated by a gentleman named Jonathan Davis. Jonathan Davis has read a fuckload of Star Wars books on audio, multiple New Jedi Order books, Shatterpoint, Survivor's Quest, Yoda Dark Rendezvous. I'm just picking random ones off the list. He read
Yoda Dark Rendezvous is also top tier Legends content.
I love that book so much.
It slaps.
Darth Bane, the whole trilogy, he read that. And then for canon, he has been reading all the way through. He's had voices in from a certain point of view, all three of them. Put a pin in a certain point of view. We'll come back to that book later on in the episode. But he also, interestingly, I discovered, it's so funny, Andy, that you were willing to come on and discuss this book, because Jonathan Davis actually did the audiobook for Lords of the Sith.
Oh. Oh.
And if listeners want to know my opinion of the audiobook of Lords of the Sith, there's an episode of a show called Force Friends Rewatch that they can listen to.
It's a good book, and it's a great Force Friends episode. We have a top tier guest.
I think he's kind of mid, but that's okay. So there's some extra information for you on Revenge of the Sith. Andy, I'll guess I'll start out with, what do you think of Star Wars Revenge of the Sith, the novel?
Okay, I need to say this without sounding pretentious.
You're discussing me. You're just talking to me, and like I will
Fair.
be the most pretentious sounding person in the room at any given time. So trust me, you'll be good.
I read a lot of books. I read a lot of comic books. I read a lot of graphic novels. I read a lot of regular novels. I love any and all genres. I don't care so much about genre as much as I care about like just good books. So when I say that, like, if you only read Star Wars books, you should read more books. I hope that doesn't sound pretentious, because there's just tons of stuff out. And I do think as Star Wars fans, we kind of get locked into like, I only read Star Wars comics and I only read Star Wars novels, and like, you're missing out on stuff. Like, don't get me wrong, I love Star Wars and there's a metric fuck ton of it. So like, you could just read Star Wars books till you die and you'll never run out.
It's so hard to keep up with. It's painful to keep up with. As a guy who has to do that, it's painful to keep up with it.
And like, I do think Star Wars can like limit authors sometimes. Like when you find an author you really love from like a Star Wars book, and then you read their other stuff, you might be really impressed, and like even more impressed, and fall more in love with them because they're not writing in the confines of a pre-established canon. All of that being said, this book is not just a great Star Wars book, it is a phenomenal fucking book. Like this book is goddamn Shakespeare. Like this book fucking rules. And it's a movie adaptation. Like it's a goddamn movie adaptation from 2005. What the fuck was Matthew Stover on that he was like, I'm gonna put my whole bussy into this and just like write goddamn art. It's so good. There's a line in my favorite movie. It's called Brothers Bloom, and he's talking about a con artist, and he's like, my brother writes cons the way dead Russians write novels, and like, I just think of Matthew Stover whenever I hear that line. I'm like, Matthew Stover writes Star Wars the way dead Russians write novels. Like this shit is just insane.
We made the point because one of the last episodes that Bradley and I did together was Black Spire, the novel Black Spire by Delilah S. Dawson. And I made the point in Black Spire, all Delilah Dawson had to do in that book was sell people on the theme park. That was her only job in that book. It was released purely for the intent of going, here's all the magical things you can do at Star Wars Galaxy's Edge in Disneyland. And she went, what if I wrote a goddamn piece of art about trauma and PTSD and forgiveness and all of this shit? The same point can be applied to the Revenge of the Sith novel, except it's like 100,000 times more, because you read this novel and you're like, did George Lucas actually write this story? Like, is this a story?
Lucas isn't a good enough writer.
This is like, what if Revenge of the Sith was written by somebody who just popped the fuck off for no reason? Like, I reread the book to prepare for this podcast because it had been several years since I had read it. I read it in a day. And with adult novels, I never read something in a day. I don't think I've finished like any of the High Republic adult books in one single day, and I devour those. This I read in one single day. Basically, I'd read like 3 chapters the night before, because it's insane. He's not just writing the words that are in the script. Or even adding a little context, like I know that the Dark Knight novelization, which I've read, that one approaches expanding the story by like adding more context to who the various goons and things are and what's going on in the script. This one, Matthew Stover was like, what if I clawed my way inside the heads of every single one of these characters and just laid their innermost emotions bare in beautiful poetry? Like, God damn, this book is so good.
The dark is generous. Its first gift is concealment. Our true faces lie in the dark beneath our skins. Our true hearts remain shadowed deeper still. But the greatest concealment lies not in protecting our secret truths, but in hiding from us the truths of others. The dark protects us from what we dare not know.
Isn't that the opening line of the book?
I have no idea. I'm just on Goodreads.
It's either the opening. It's either the opening line or it's one of the intro. It's crazy because he has this like running motif about the sun dragon that is crazy. And if you're listening to this podcast and you've never read the Revenge of the Sith novel, if you've only really read canon content and you read Brotherhood and you thought Brotherhood was really good, this was the novel that inspired Mike Chin to write the Brotherhood novel.
And the dark is generous and it is patient and it always wins. But in the heart of its strength lies its weakness. One lone candle is enough to hold it back. Love is more than a candle. Love can ignite the stars.
And that is the end of the book.
Like, Jesus.
Where did this come from? Like, I remember reading this book because it came out in 2005. I believe I read it very quickly after I saw the movie. I read the comic first, then saw the movie, then read this book. And I've read this book probably 100 times. I literally, as I was flipping through it to read through it, I was noticing like, oh, there's like food stains and stuff in here from when I was a teenager because I read the book that often. Like the pages are yellowed. Like it's crazy how many times I've read this book because I'm like, Jesus Christ, it's so good. You know one thing that Matthew Stover does that I've honestly never seen anyone else do well?
What is that?
He writes a banger Palpatine internal monologue.
Yeah, he does. He writes a banger.
I've never seen someone do that. Never in my life have I. And most of the ones I've read verge from this is basically okay to I'm gonna pretend this didn't happen. When he gets inside Palpatine's head, it's just like, oh.
The dark is generous and it is patient. It is the dark that seeds cruelty into justice, that drips contempt into compassion, that poisons love with grains of doubt. The dark can be patient because the slightest drop of rain will cause those seeds to sprout. The rain will come and the seeds will sprout, for the dark is the soil in which they grow, and it is the clouds above them, and it waits behind the stars that gives them light. The dark's patience is infinite. Eventually, even stars burn out. Like that's scripture. Like that's biblical. Like it's just so good. And like it's a movie novelization. Like that's crazy. Like movie novelizations are usually not very good. And like there's ones
I've read even the Star Wars ones I think have been mostly basically okay, and they got some decently heavy hitters. Like R.A. Salvatore wrote the one for Attack of the Clones. I couldn't tell you shit about that book. I've read it. I couldn't tell you anything about it. I can remember specific parts of Revenge of the Sith even before I picked up and read it, because this book is it's not just that he's adding additional context. It's just that the way he writes is like poetry.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. He understood that he was writing a mythology, like a mythological tale.
That's right on the money. Is he fully understood that like at the time this is the last Star Wars, and that like he was not writing it like a typical movie novelization where you kind of do the plot and you add a little extra inner dialogue and you add a little extra context. He was like, no, I am like oral traditioning around the campfire the legend of fucking Hercules. Like that is how he approached this book, and it slaps. Like it would have been so easy for him to miss this shot because it's such a big swing and he leaves it all out there, and it's so goddamn good.
The other thing that I really appreciated too, talking about like he didn't have to do this but he did it anyway, is I'm reading through and every time Stover can make a reference to something that happened in the Clone Wars multimedia project, he will do it. Mm-hmm. This is a movie adaptation that feels like the finale of the multimedia project. From the Wikipedia article, very rarely do I ever confuse those in that direction. Usually it's the other direction. Events from other expanded universe publications are also referenced, including the Star Wars Republic comic book series, the Star Wars Clone Wars animated series, that's the Tartakovsky one, and the novels The Approaching Storm, Shatterpoint, The Cestus Deception, and Yoda Dark Rendezvous. So this man was like, not only am I going to understand this movie, all of you nerds who just spent like 3 years of your lives reading these books and comics, you're going to read this and be like, oh, they mentioned Jabim. They mentioned that Anakin hasn't smiled since Jabim. And as a guy who read Star Wars Republic, I was like, I know what that's about.
I know why he was not smiling.
I know why he was not smiling.
So this is something that I talk about a lot on like Twitter and on Force Friends Rewatch. When Disney decanonized Legend, as much as like part of that like frustrated me or hurt me a little bit, like I totally got it, because that is what Lucas did when he wanted to make his 3D. Because what people forget, and what I have argued with so many like neckbeards on Twitter about, is that between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, there were novels and comics and video games and RPGs and all sorts of shit came out that was all canon, and it fully plotted out the whole Clone Wars from day one Clone War right up to Revenge of the Sith, and you could follow the timeline in the different books and comics.
It was one of the first times that it even been attempted to that scale. Like the Clone Wars Multimedia Project is an incredible piece of canon building.
And you would know which episode of the TV show you were watching fell in where, and like it would take time for characters to like travel to locations, so they would like be off the board from other people from using them, because like, well, so-and-so's got to get from here to there, so you can't have them show up in that comic or this chapter of the book, whatever. And it was really fleshed out. And when Lucas decided he wanted to do the 3D show, the first 2 seasons are out of order chronologically. Like episodes just jump around because Lucas was trying to fill in gaps from the established timeline already, because he didn't want to decanonize anything. And after 2 seasons of that, he said, this is annoying. Fuck it. None of that's canon anymore. Only the movies and this show is canon. And as someone who had spent like all of my middle school, like following along with all of the books and games and shows and comics, when he did that, it broke my little nerd heart, but like it calloused me to when it would happen again years and years later when I graduated college. I was already like, oh yeah, Lucas did that before. That's fine. That makes sense. Yep. We're getting movies. It's totally worth it. And like,
it's like listening to myself recount my own experience, because I had pretty much the exact same experience. Because I remember it was after he had made the first 2 seasons, or he'd been working on them, because it was around the time the movie came out that he started saying, no, we're just going to ignore that. We're going to do whatever we want with it. And I remember that was one of the reasons that I, in my horrible toxicness as an 18-year-old, did not watch the show. I hated the movie and I did not watch the show. And part of the reason was I was so mad that I had gotten committed to this Clone Wars that I had lived through. If you were there, if you were in the trenches, if you were reading like the novels as they were coming out.
Ventress torturing Alpha and Obi-Wan, which also probably broke my little gay
which
brain,
gets mentioned.
They were very naked.
Gets mentioned in this book, actually.
Yeah.
Ventress torturing Alpha and Obi-Wan, I believe, gets mentioned in this book. That, living through that, it was like a formative experience if you were at that age. And it really is, I changed my toxic opinions, because you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
You are allowed, hey, Twitter, come here. You're allowed to change your opinions over time. It's fine. No one's going to get mad at you. And if they do, they're wrong. But I've also heard like experiences too. And one thing that I look back on, I was like, what was 18-year-old me thinking? Is we've had guests on the show who are like middle school when the TV show was coming out, and that was their Clone Wars. And they had that same experience with the TV show. And I was like, that's cool. But I did think, as I was reading through this Revenge of the Sith novel, like it sparked things in my brain. Like I'm already on a Legends kick anyway, because 2 days after recording this episode, I will be at Legends Con. But it sparked things in my brain of like, oh yeah, I really did like the Clone Wars Multimedia Project a lot. Oh, I played the shit out of Republic Commando. I played the shit out of that game, which still is good, the game. Shame they never wrote any novels to tie into it.
Yeah,
shame that never happened. That never happened.
We won't go down that dark trail.
We are not going down that road. But the way that this book, like, And it even made pains, like, it references Labyrinth of Evil. Labyrinth of Evil came out January 2005 and immediately precedes this book in the chronology. And Stover, like, has scenes. There's a scene where Mace Windu tells Obi-Wan, I'm pretty sure it's Obi-Wan, explicitly, like, we were tracking Sidious. We tracked him to the basement of 500 Republica, which is the apartment building where most of the Republic, like bigwigs in Legends, live. That's something you see in Labyrinth of Evil, and it was mentioned in this book. It just feels like it's tying the movie to the multimedia project while also serving as that finale to the multimedia project. And I'm just like, Stover, you didn't have to do that, but you kind of changed my life when you did that.
It's truly like not only a love letter to the prequel movies, but it's a love letter to all of the Legends material that was happening at the time, the old EU. And it's so respectful, it's so beautiful, it does such a good job. It never feels like it's like just having references for the sake of extra references. It never feels inorganic. It always feels really natural. And like, if you don't pick up on any of that stuff, like if you've only seen the movies and you've only seen the Clone Wars cartoon and then you pick up this book, you'll be fine. Like, you might like wonder like, why does anyone mention Ahsoka? But like, other than that, you're gonna be fine.
Because she didn't exist yet.
You're not gonna like feel like, oh, what was Jabim or what was this, or like you just won't catch any of that. But if you were engrossed in it all at the time, you're gonna pick up on all of these little hints and nods and references, and it's super cool.
It's wild to me. I can tell you for a fact that just based on the quality of this novel, that when in 20 years or whatever, when they do get to from a certain point of view for Revenge of the Sith, one, I want on that book so badly, you have no idea. But two, that from a certain point of view for this movie is going to be elevated in part because this novelization is such a foundational piece of Star Wars media that it inspired people who are working on Star Wars right now or inspired by this novel. Like, I cannot possibly oversell how important this novel is, because it did super raise the bar for Star Wars publishing after it came out. And it's also so bizarre to me to listen to Magic the Gathering fans complain about, what is it, Test of Metal, that Stover also wrote? Because they like to pretend that novel didn't happen. And I'm like, no, come over and play with us in Star Wars Land, where he's writing the best Star Wars book of all time. Like, it's good. It's so good.
Whenever there is a mentality amongst newer fans who became fans post Disney, to kind of point at the old EU and laugh at it. And don't get me wrong, there's some silly stuff. And don't get me wrong, I also
frequently point and laugh at it.
There are old EU fans who are clowns. They're fucking clowns and they deserve to be laughed. But something that I like to tell them is like, hey, just because something isn't canon anymore doesn't mean it's not worth still reading and like enjoying. And like, art is art. This also sounds pretentious. I hate the word content. Like, art is art. Calling it content devalues the art, in my opinion. And like, this is no less a great book because it's no longer canon. And if you read Labyrinth of Evil, Revenge of the Sith, and then Kenobi, you kind of get your own little trilogy, like unofficial trilogy of 3 novels that are like tell this beautiful tale of the end of the prequel era. And God, it's such a good reading experience. And like, those 3 books, like, were not intended to be read together, but they're phenomenal, and they're no less phenomenal just because they're not canon anymore. And like, what even is canon? Because if the people who are making Star Wars now are influenced by this book and they're taking inspiration from it in the books they are writing, well, then that is canon. Like, that canon is what still affects the current media. Like, that means they're canon.
As a guy who, like, his whole thing is like knowing as much about Star Wars as possible, which is, you know, my cross to bear, that I have taken it upon myself to be that guy for everyone around me. Current canon doesn't even line up, so who the fuck cares if something is really good? And there's quite a bit of Legends, like, and I you know, there's qualifiers to this, but I'll say most of Legends is baseline fine. There's some stuff that's really good, there's some stuff that's really bad. But there are certainly novels in that I can point to, either because they're very good books, like Revenge of the Sith, or there's some that I can point to and I'm like, those are still worth reading just because they're interesting. Like the choices that were made in them were interesting choices that inform where things are going or go with the Disney era.
My spiciest take, my hottest, spiciest take is that the original Thrawn trilogy is not as good as people remember it. Timothy Zahn didn't know how to write women at the time. He only learned that with the first new Thrawn novel where he wrote Governor Price really well. But like his Leia is so out of character. It is so not Leia. His Mon Mothma is so out of character. It's so not Mon Mothma.
Oh, I'm dreading going back to those because we all know that I am one of the bigger Mon Mothma fans on the internet.
Good luck.
It's in the trenches. The fact that certain projects that are struck work are not projects that I'm discussing anywhere, including on this podcast.
Sure.
However, my DMs are a minefield right now. I'm just going to say that. But you were saying,
that being said, yeah, the original Thrawn trilogy is bizarre. Like Luke is also, all of the characters are just kind of weird. However, Zahn had some like really interesting and compelling ideas. And he has some original characters who are awesome. Mara Jade does not become awesome until other writers get their hands on her. I'm sorry, Zahn, I know she's your baby. But that being said, going back and reading those books now, incredibly fascinating because they're a time capsule. They're a time capsule to like Star Wars was kind of dead at the time. It's super interesting because like the internet didn't really exist in the way that it does now. No one knew what the Clone Wars were. So like Luke is running around and Jeru Sabayoth and shit. Like it's just like bonkers stuff of this author just like going off the rails with his OCs and his own ideas about what different stuff in the OT meant. And it's a really fun read. It's super compelling. I understand its importance to fandom at the time it was written, and I fully respect that. It maybe doesn't hold up well in like a modern context, other than being this fascinating time capsule to like totally different era of Star Wars fandom. So like, yeah, there's stuff in Legends like that where it's interesting, but for different reasons than like intended. And like maybe it holds up on its own as art, maybe it doesn't. But the Revenge of the Sith novel holds up. It's fucking art.
It still does. Yeah, I have my own too. Like I have certain books that I'm like, either this didn't age well, Hello Courtship of Princess Leia, ugh, I don't know what's going on with that. But then there's some that didn't age well in like a funny way, like Death Troopers. I fucking love bringing up Death Troopers. I don't really like the book anymore.
I remember when that cover was really everywhere. It was on t-shirts. It was on signs. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Because this was
real proud of that.
This is 2008 or so. 2008, 2009. This was the height of like zombie craze.
Yeah, zombie everything was everywhere.
Everything, which fortunately for me, I had gotten really into the Living Dead movies, or just the Dead movie at that point. And I also had discovered World War Z, so I was like, hell yeah, I'm all about putting zombies in Star Wars. And now I'm looking back and I'm like, oh, they were out of ideas. They had no idea what to do when they put zombies in Star Wars. But Revenge of the Sith, the only place that I felt Revenge of the Sith doesn't really hold up is the way it handles Padme. And I'm not going to bash Stover too much for that. He is working off of George Lucas's terrible story, and I didn't necessarily fully trust him to be able to give this character a stupid amount of depth. She's fine. My problem is she's mainly defined in this book by her relationship to Anakin, and it keeps coming back to that relationship with Anakin. Like even when it gets in her head,
that's the movie. Sadly,
bringing up, and it's kind of the movie, and it's kind of the men just didn't even try to write women at that point. Like it's the only stuff in there is that makes me kind of go, I don't like this as much as the rest of the book. But he's doing okay with the material that he's given, and other women such as they show up in this book, because there's not a lot of them, because there's only one woman with a speaking role in the entire fucking movie. when they do show up, they're pretty good. Mon Mothma has some good scenes in this. Like, I really like how this book portrays her and Bail are clearly doing something. She has a conversation with Bail, which I thought was really interesting, where Mon is the one pushing for like them to do something. She's the one being like, we need to do something, and Bale's trying to be really cautious of, well, I don't know if we... She's like, no, do you not clearly see the constitutional amendment happening in front of you? There is something that needs to be done. And it's just so interesting in comparison to like how fandom thinks about her nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she has a small role, which is very interesting. Shakti has like one scene that's pretty interesting. When Anakin leaves the temple to go to the Chancellor's office while the Jedi are arresting Palpatine. So all that's at least decently in there, but that was my only real issue with the book, was the Padme stuff. I think didn't hold up as well as the rest of it does.
And like there's no spoilers to be had here. Like, one, the
this
book
is an adaptation of the movie.
Years old, and two, it is an adaptation of a movie. So like, you've seen, if you're listening to this podcast, you've seen Revenge of the Sith. You know what happens.
Normally I would step in and be like, well, I do want to say that I want to make these episodes listenable to anybody who hasn't necessarily read the book, who is thinking about reading the book, blah, 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 but this is Revenge of the Sith. You know what happens in Revenge of the Sith.
You know the beats. That being
you know what
said,
happens in this story.
Nothing either of us could prepare you for how Matthew Stover is going to grab your face and stick his hand down your throat and grab your beating heart, yank it out, slap you in the face with it, and then shove it up your ass. Like, that is what this book will do to you. It is that good. Do
you know what else it is? You know what else I was shocked by when I reread it?
What were you shocked by?
This book is kind of gay. And not in the sense of like, you can insert a homosexual reading or a queer reading into the text. Like, it comes about as close to the line of saying Obi-Wan Kenobi is a homosexual as you could reasonably get prior to the Disney acquisition. And I know he's like queer-ish now. It's kind of nebulous, but if you read this book, there's parts, like there's one part where somebody,
he recognizes Anakin by his ass.
Yeah, he recognizes Anakin's ass. There's a scene where somebody, I think it's Palpatine, tells Anakin, like, Obi-Wan Kenobi was seen leaving a senator's residence at an ungodly hour of the morning. And Anakin's first reaction is, well, who is this senator? Let's go question him. And it's supposed to be a twist in the context of the story that it's a her because it's Padme.
Yeah.
But the fact that Anakin's first thought was, oh, Obi-Wan sneaking out of somebody's house in the morning must be a guy. And then the fucking scene where Padme's literally Padme to Obi-Wan's back is like, you love him too, don't you? And he doesn't say a word. And I'm like, this also, book right up on the line of being like,
Cody flirts with him.
Cody does flirt with him.
Yeah. It is not like witty, like soldiers in the trenches banter, other than when witty soldiers in the trenches banter is also gay. Like, it is gay, flirty banter.
Oh my God. This book is about as close as you can get in 2005 to just coming out and saying that one of these characters is gay.
Unless you're Jude Watson.
Unless you're Jude Watson, who found that line and literally like made sure that the toe was on the line. Like,
he's my partner.
Yeah. I was going through because I was preparing a slideshow for a panel this weekend, and I was going through and reading quotes because I've never actually read those books all the way through. I read sporadic books of the Jude Watson books because there was just so many of them.
Yeah, she was pumping them
and I had kind of aged out of them by the time they hit The Last of the Jedi, but I'm reading some of these quotes and going, And I'm also kind of mad because I spent my teen years having a crush on very heterosexual Ben Skywalker when Ferris Olin was right there.
Right there. I had his miniature and everything.
Right there. And like, my type is morally questionable men with white hair. My phone lock screen is Fenris. I would have been down so bad for this man.
You should cosplay him.
I really should at some point.
You would make a great Last of the Jedi Ferris Olin. Or
You know what? You know what? I'm gonna put that on my Halloween costume list or at some point. I don't do a lot of cosplay, but I really should
no
do
one will know
fairy.
who you are, but all of the other millennial gays who grew up reading those books. But
Anyone who it's one of those anyone who identifies who I am thing is immediately cool.
is immediately your best friend.
Is
Yeah, for
immediately
sure.
my best friend. The sort of thought that I had that I wanted to throw out before I lead into the final thoughts, which I'm gonna ask in a particular way. Listeners, come here. We need to have a little conversation. I need to deliver a warning. I need to deliver a personal warning to you. Do not listen to me. I'm dead serious here. Do not read the Revenge of the Sith novelization and then 2 days later pick up From a Certain Point of View Return of the Jedi. And do not then read the short story Brotherhood by Mike Chen, not to be confused with the novel Brotherhood by Mike Chen. Because if you are like me, you will burst into tears. You will genuinely start crying. Who lines into Brotherhood, the short story by Mike Chen? I bawl. The short story in Return of the Jedi basically is an epilogue to the Revenge of the Sith novelization. Like, he put some references to the Revenge of the Sith novelization in the novel Brotherhood. The short story just is a reference. It is a giant reference. One of the quotes that Andy read earlier is mentioned in those first two lines. And the minute I read those, I was like, oh, we're in for it now. I had to stop reading multiple times. I had to put the book down and walk away multiple times.
Love it.
Because I couldn't see through my tears. I had to walk into my boyfriend's room and be like, I need you to take note of the tears running down my face. Because later, I will ask you to confirm that these two books, Revenge of the Sith, the novelization, followed immediately by the From a Certain Point of View, Return of the Jedi, made me cry over Anakin fucking Skywalker. That's how good these things are. That is my warning, but also kind of recommendation for everyone. Go feel my pain. Andy.
That's me.
For the final thought that I have, I want to frame it a certain way. I want to ask, why should people read this book?
Boy, howdy. Like, I have hyped this book up a lot in the past 40 minutes. I've said a lot of grandiose statements about how good it is. There's really nothing I can say that could prepare you to read it for the first time if you've never done that. What I will say is that I am extremely jealous of anyone listening to this podcast who has not read this book yet, because that means you get to read it for the first time and have your heart broken and your brain explode, and it's falling in love with the prequels over again. And I was 8 years old when Phantom Menace came out. I was like, I don't know, like 14 or something, 13 when Revenge of the Sith came out. Like, I was the right age for those.
We're the same age.
Yeah. And like, God, it was such an incredible experience growing up with the prequels. And if you haven't read this book, you will feel like that kid again. You will fall in love with these characters and that story again, because that's how good it is. And if you've never loved the prequels, maybe you were too old when they came out, or you were too young, and you've seen them and you've liked them, but you've never gotten to experience them as like a fucking 11-year-old, read this goddamn book, because you will be 11 years old in 1999 for the first time. Like, it will just transport you back to an age and a time where this was all new and exciting and beautiful. And this book slaps. Like, it's really goddamn good. I'm Obi-Kin trash, so like there's little hints and nods as previously mentioned, but like, I'd love it even if it wasn't like slightly alluding to an inappropriate sexual relationship between a Jedi Master and his former apprentice. Like, it's just that damn good. So pick it up, read it, listen to it on Audible. You'll thank me. You'll find me out of One Hat Town, and you'll say, I listened to you on Goldsquadrongays, and I took your advice, and I read the Revenge of the Sith novelization, and you're right, it's goddamn Shakespeare.
That's how you do a plug.
And
wow.
You'll know. I'll know that you listened. I'll know that you listened to my advice, and you'll thank me. You'll fucking thank me, and you'll ask for more, and I'll say there is no more. Reread it.
There's nothing I could say that covers anything that hasn't already been covered. Not only, I think people should read this book if they're Star Wars fans and they want a capsule of what the Star Wars media, what the publishing, what the comics, all of that was like in 2005.
Animation,
all of that, because there's references to the Gendy
LucasArts.
Tartakovsky series. Yep. That if you want that time capsule, it's worth reading. If you love the movie, it's worth reading. It's worth reading, really, at the end of the day for me, because this book was so good that reading it as a 14-year-old changed my life. And reading it as a 32-year-old made me feel that same level of emotion. Like, I will not hype up another book on this podcast to the degree that I will hype up Matthew Stover's Revenge of the Sith. Please read this book. It's unbelievable what he does with this material. We cannot explain it to you. You have to experience it.
Every time I've been in a room with uber Star Wars fans and we've started talking about our favorite Star Wars books, I love to do a thing where I'll ask people, like, what's your favorite Star Wars book? And I'll wait to go last. And when it gets to me and I'll say Matthew Stover's Revenge of the Sith novelization, every single time, everyone throws up their hands and goes, oh, goddamn, you're right. I forgot about that one. It is the best Star Wars, because it is. It is the best Star Wars. Like, Star Wars, we did it. We've already hit it. We've got the best book. It came out in 2005. If you haven't read it, go read it.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for coming on to talk to me about Star Wars Revenge of the Sith by Matthew Stover. Where can the people find you?
Sure. Like I mentioned, I'm at a One Hat Town on everything. I do cosplay Anakin on my Instagram. Every time I post a picture,
I mentioned
this book.
You mentioned last time that you didn't mention that you cosplayed both Gold Leaders.
Yes.
Dutch Vander and Anakin Skywalker. Now, sadly, I do have to inform you there was a third Gold Leader.
Lando.
It's Lando. However, you have cosplayed two of them.
I have cosplayed two of the three Gold Leaders. Lando is by far the most fashionable and coolest Gold Leader. Not in the cards for me to cosplay Lando. Yeah, I do cosplay. I also have like sexy pictures on there, so if that's not your thing, maybe don't check it out. But if that is your thing, go check it out. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Tumblr, you can follow me all there. I post all my podcasts and shit, so if you want to hear me play tabletop RPGs or talk about Star Wars or talk about other TV shows, you'll see links to all that shit there. So
awesome. Well, thank you once again for coming, and I'm sure Bradley, who is going to be editing these episodes, is going to both go and read this fucking book, Bradley.
Go read it, Bradley.
Go read it, motherfucker. And then also run our socials.
Yeah, thanks, Bradley. And thank you for having me back on my favorite Star Wars podcast. It's always a delight to get to come on here and talk with you guys. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Gold Squadron Gaze. Did Charles fuck something up? Send us a message at goldsquadrongaze@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at Gold Squad Gaze. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Gold Squadron Gaze. Subscribe to us on YouTube at Gold Squadron Gaze, where we post the podcast as well as exclusive content. Please join us next week and every week for more of Gold Squadron Gaze.